Assalamualaikum and a very good day again. So we are here today to discuss a new chapter which is on cost theory. Okay, so this is actually a continuation from the previous chapter where we have looked at production. Okay, so remember, in production our main aim is to actually determining what is the ideal or the optimal number of resources to use, okay, in the short run and also in the long run. Okay, but at the end of the day, for managers, okay, what's important is to get the maximum profit possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to translate, okay, the production process into monetary term, and hence, okay, today we're going to look at cost theory. Right now, why is it important, okay, for us to analyze, okay, cost? Well, the thing is, for managers, okay, their main objective is to get the maximum profit, and to achieve that objective they want to produce the highest quality products, okay, but they want to make sure that the cost is held at the lowest possible cost. All right, and the thing is, if firms, okay, they are satisfied, okay, with whatever they have, okay, so they're going to find out that one day competitors, okay, will arise and produce at a much lower cost, and this will drive the firms, okay, out of business. So to remain competitive, okay, in the market, managers needs to find, okay, the lowest possible method to produce their product, okay, or else, okay, there's going to be competitors who will come into the market and basically remove them, drive them out, okay, of the business. Now, when we analyze, okay, cost, bear in mind that the cost differs, okay, depending on the time of production, okay, because in the short run we are dealing with different types of resources as opposed to the long run, and the shape of the size of the firm is different. And the thing is, when we talk about large production, okay, firms are able to enjoy things like economics of scale or economics of scopes, okay, but the thing is, smaller firms also have some advantages whereby they are more flexible and agile, okay. So in this chapter also we're going to look at the benefits of being a large company and what would also be the cost, okay, or the disadvantages of being a large corporation instead of a smaller one. So hopefully by analyzing, okay, cost, we are able to find, okay, the lower cost method to produce goods and services. Now, this chapter can be divided into three main topics, okay. So for the first part, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the measurement of cost, okay, or the nature of cost. So we're going to see how economists define cost actually. Now the second part would look at the cost of production in short run. Okay, so remember that in the previous chapter we have looked at production in the short run. So what we're going to do in the cost chapter, we're going to try to understand what will be the cost involved, okay, when firm produce in the short run. And the last topic would be looking at the production in the long run. Okay, now let's start with the first one. So we're going to look at the way economists define cost. Okay, so this brings us to the nature of cost. Okay, now cost, okay, can be so the way we define cost, it differs, okay, from the accountant's perspective and also the economist's perspective. Okay, so when we talk about cost, okay, the way we measure it, so we can divide it into explicit cost or implicit cost. Okay, so explicit cost is also known as accounting cost. Okay, but when we talk about economic cost, okay, so we are going to look at the concept of implicit cost, okay, and also the concept of opportunity cost. Now, apart from that, other relevant cost concept that we need to know would be incremental cost and also sunk cost. All right. So let us look at how economists and accountants define costs. Now, when we talk about costs, okay, so costs are incurred, okay, due to the production process. Okay. Now, as I mentioned just now, the two groups of people, economists and accountants, they see costs differently. Okay. So for economists, okay, they define costs in terms of opportunities, okay, that are sacrificed when a choice is being made. Okay. So therefore, when we talk about economic costs, they are simply the benefits, okay, that are lost. But for accountants, okay, they define costs in terms of the resources that have been consumed. Okay, so accounting costs actually reflect the changes in stocks, for example, reductions in good things, okay, increases in bad things over a fixed period of time. All right. Okay, next we're going to look at what's the difference between explicit costs and implicit costs. Let's start with explicit costs. Now, explicit costs are actual expenditures, okay, that the firm will incur when they hire, rent, or purchase inputs required in the production. Okay, so example of explicit costs would be wages, okay, that firms pay to hire labor, the rental price of capital, equipment and buildings, and also the purchase price of raw materials and semi-finished products. So when we talk about explicit costs, so explicit cost refers to the actual out-of-pocket expenditure. So it is whatever spending, okay, that requires you to pay money, okay, to get, okay, all the resources for your production. Now, the second type of cost that you need to know would be implicit cost. Okay. Now, implicit cost refers to the value of the inputs, okay, that are owned and used by the firm in its own production activity. So meaning that implicit cost would be the cost of using your own resources in the production process. Okay. So what are some of these examples of implicit cost? Well, it includes the highest salary that the entrepreneur could earn in his or her best alternative employment, or the highest return that the firm could receive from investing its capital in the most rewarding alternative use, or it can also be renting its land and buildings to the highest bidder. So looking at this example, we can see that implicit cost would actually look at the things that you need to forego, okay, in order to pursue your production, right? Okay, so now that we have looked at the difference between explicit cost and economic cost, explicit cost and implicit cost, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the different definition of cost from the point of view of economists and accountants. So let's start with economic cost. Okay, now when we talk about economic cost, it refers to the sum of explicit and implicit costs. Okay, so this cost should be distinguished from the accounting cost, because accounting costs only focus on the actual expenditure of the firm, or we say it as explicit cost. All right, so when we talk about economic cost, so economists, when they want to measure cost, they will include both explicit and implicit cost. So remember that explicit cost would be the actual expenditure, okay, out of pocket expenditure, but implicit cost would be the cost of using your own resources. Okay, now because it is because there is no cash payments, okay, when it comes to implicit cost, so economists tend to use the concept of opportunity cost to measure implicit cost. But when we talk about accounting costs only comprise of explicit cost. Now, because the definition of costs differ, so this will definitely influence the way we calculate profit. Okay, so as you all know, profit is the difference between total revenue and total cost. Okay, but accountants, when they want to calculate profit, they will only consider accounting cost. So to calculate accounting profit, what we need to do is we need to find the difference between total revenue and accounting cost, where accounting costs only comprise of explicit costs. Okay. As for economic profit, you can see that it includes, okay, all the definition of cost. So to find economic profit, we still find the difference between total revenue and cost, but cost, okay, is considered as economic cost, and it comprises of explicit and implicit cost. Okay, so bear in mind that, okay, in economics, okay, when we talk about cost, we consider both explicit and implicit cost. So explicit cost would be the cash, okay, payment, okay, your actual expenditure to buy resources for the production. But when we talk about implicit cost, that is the cost of using your own resources in the production process. For example, let's say you want to open up a restaurant, okay, but you already have, okay, your shop lots, so you don't need to incur any rent payment or any loan payment, okay, to acquire the restaurant. But from the point of view of economists, you still need to value the restaurant even though there is no actual cash payment. So how do you value the restaurant? In terms of the next alternative use. Okay, so that would be, if you're not using the shop lots, okay, for your restaurant business, so what are you going to do? So definitely you're going to rent it out, isn't it? So how much you're going to gain? So that would be the value that you should put on your shop lots. Okay, so because the way we calculate cost differs between accountants and economics, therefore when we calculate profit, you're going to see that accounting profit, okay, would have a much higher value as opposed to economic profit. Okay, alright, so what we're going to do next is I'm going to show you some examples, okay, so that you are much clearer in terms of how we calculate economic profit, accounting profit, economic cost, and accounting cost. But before that, let me highlight to you some of the other cost concept that you need to know. Okay. Now, next we go into alternative or opportunity cost. Okay. Now remember that the cost to the firm, okay, of using a purchase or own input is actually equal to what the input could earn in the best alternative use. Okay, so the firm must include the alternative, or what we call as opportunity cost, because the firm cannot retain a higher input if it pays a lower price for the input than another firm. So remember just now, okay, I was mentioning about implicit cost. Okay, so because implicit cost doesn't involve any actual cash payment, so we're going to use the concept of opportunity cost to measure it. Okay. Okay. Next would be the relevant and irrelevant costs. Okay. So when we talk about relevant costs, okay, so this would include the cost, okay, that should be considered in making a managerial decision. Okay, so when we talk about relevant costs, it would include economic costs, or we call it as opportunity costs. Okay, now incremental cost is the total increase in cost for implementing certain managerial decision, and incremental cost is very important in decision making. Okay, but when we talk about sunk costs, so sunk costs are considered as irrelevant costs. Okay, so they are not, okay, important, okay, in managerial decision making. All right, so when we talk about the relevant costs in making decision, okay, the relevant ones would be the economic costs, okay, but sunk costs are considered as the irrelevant costs. Now that we have looked at the definition of explicit cost, implicit cost, accounting cost, economic cost, accounting profit, economic profit, let us try some examples to see, okay, the extent you understand the concept that we have looked at. All right. Okay, now this question is actually taken, okay, from the previous semester question. So we have a situation, okay, whereby Amin's father gave Amin a construction company with an asset worth of 400,000. Okay, so Amin proudly told to some of his fellow directors that his revenues were typically 35,000 per month, while his operating cost for fuel was 8,000 and maintenance 5,000 per month. Now, the estimated depreciation is 10,000 per annum. Okay, it's 10,000 per month. An office space similar to Amin's office space can be rented for 15,000 per month. And if Amin was working for one of his competing construction company, he would earn 5,000 per month. Okay, so this is the current situation. Okay, so we have Amin who inherit a construction company from his father. So he has identified the relevant costs, okay, that he needs to incur, all right, in managing this construction company. Now your task is to identify, okay, the explicit cost and also implicit cost, because at the end of the day we want to know whether this business is profitable. All right, now let us start with identifying the explicit cost. Okay, now so looking at this situation, can you identify what would be the explicit cost? Alright, so when we look at the situation again, as you can see, the explicit cost comprise of 3 items. Okay, that would be operating cost for fuel. Okay, you also include maintenance and depreciation charges. Okay, because all these involve actual cash payment. Okay, so remember, explicit costs are costs that involve actual cash payment. It is out-of-pocket expenditure. So for Amin, when he wants to manage this construction company, then he needs to pay, okay, for operating costs of fuel, maintenance, and also depreciation charges. Now, let us move on to the second question. Can you identify the implicit cost? Okay, now remember that implicit cost is the cost of using your own resources in the production process. So looking at the situation, okay, can you identify the items, okay, that can be included under implicit cost? Now, notice that, okay, when you read, okay, the case, you can see that Amin, okay, is using his own office space, which can be rented out for 15,000 per month. Okay, so if he is not doing his construction company, so he can rent the office space and earn 15,000. But if he wants to run the construction company, then he wouldn't be able to earn the 15,000 rent. Okay, so as you can see here, this office space is considered as your own resources, Amin own resources, and this is included under implicit cost. Okay, so the foregone rent, okay, that he may get if he doesn't run the construction company is considered as implicit cost. Right? Now, is there any other items that can be categorized as implicit cost? Yes, that would be his own contribution. Okay, now notice that Amin, okay, if he's not working for the construction company, okay, then okay, he would be earning 5,000 per month. Okay, but because okay, he wants to run the construction company, then he would need to forego, okay, that potential salary. Okay, so you can see that to run Amin's own construction company, then he needs to use his own energy. Okay, so what happened, the value, okay, of his contribution would be 5,000 in other company, but when he works for the construction company, he has to forego the salary. So the foregone salary is also considered as implicit cost. So remember that implicit cost is the cost of using your own resources in the production process, and for the case of Amin, because he will be the one who manage the company, he will be using his own office space. So these are the two of his own resources in managing the construction company. So this is considered as implicit cost. Now, let's proceed to the third question. Now, the third question requires you to calculate, okay, Amin's monthly economic cost. Now, remember that economic cost, okay, comprise of both explicit and implicit cost. All right. Now, remember that explicit cost just now comprise of operating cost for fuel, which is 8,000. Okay, and then we have the cost of maintenance, which is 5,000, and the depreciation charges. Okay, so when you total up these three items, you're going to find out that your explicit cost is equals to 23,000. Okay, all right, so the explicit cost value here is 23,000. Now, what about the value of implicit cost? Now, we have already identified that rental foregone and salary foregone are the two items listed as implicit cost. All right. So the value, okay, of these two components would be 15,000 for rental foregone and 5,000 for salary foregone, a total of 20,000. So your economic cost is going to be 43,000. Okay. Now, let's look at the last question. Now, the last question wants you to determine whether Amin, okay, should continue managing the construction company or he simply work for somebody else. Okay. Now, this requires you to calculate the potential profit of the business. Now, to calculate profit, which profit definition should you use? Now, remember that economic profit, it includes, okay, a much wider definition of cost. So when you want to make decision whether you should continue or not, okay, a particular business, then we need to calculate economic profit. Okay. Now, economic profit is the difference between total revenue and economic cost. And from the case just now, we have already identified that total revenue is equals to 35,000. Okay. Now, economic cost has been calculated in question C. It is equals to 43,000. So as you can see, for Amin, when he continue operating this construction business, he would be earning an economic loss in the amount of 8,000. Okay, so if that is the case, should Amin continue operating the business, okay, inherited from his father? Well, the answer would be no. Okay, why is that the case? Because his economic profit is negative. So as long as economic profit is less than zero, then it is advisable for the entrepreneur for not continuing the business. However, if economic profit is greater than zero, it would be advisable for the firm to pursue or continue with the business because, okay, the total revenue or the sales can cover all the costs involved in the production, whether it is explicit or implicit cost. Okay, now just to make sure that you have a hang on the concept of explicit cost, implicit cost, accounting profit and economic profit, let us try another example. Okay, so this time around we are looking at a case which involves an architect by the name of Harry. Okay, so let us look at the case. Now we have Harry, an architect. Now he's working for a foreign consultant firm, earning 78,000 per year. Okay, now he is contemplating to give up his job and set up his own consultancy firm. Right, now he estimates that renting an office would cost 780 per month, hiring a secretary would cost 1,500 per month, and purchasing the required supplies would cost him 10,000 per annum. Now he estimated that his revenue for the year would be 120,000. Now your task would be to calculate, okay, the consultant's annual explicit cost, implicit cost, and also economic profit. Okay, now when you look at the case again, notice that some of these values, okay, are quoted on a monthly basis and others are quoted in terms of an annual basis. But the question specifically states that you need to calculate the cost and profit, okay, on an annual basis. Okay, so whatever values that are quoted on a monthly basis must be multiplied by 12 so that it would be on an annual basis. All right, okay, now let's start with the first cost. Okay, now the first cost that you need to calculate would be explicit cost. Now first of all, let us identify what would be the explicit cost that Harry needs to incur. Okay, now if you look at the question again, okay, you're gonna see that the cost or the type or the items that Harry needs to pay would include rent. Okay, so he needs to rent an office, so rental payment would be considered as part of his explicit cost, and the cost is 780 per month. Because you want to calculate on an annual term, so you have to multiply by 12. Alright, now what would be the second item included under explicit cost? And that would be the salary, okay, that you would need to pay for your secretary. Okay, and that would be 1,500 per month, and you have to multiply by 12. Okay, and the third item categorized as explicit cost would be the supplies, okay, that you have to pay for the business, and that would be 10,000 per year. So you don't need to do anything with the value because it's already quoted on an annual term. So what would be the value of explicit cost? So as you can see here, okay, your rent per year is going to be 9,360. The salary that you pay for your secretary would be 18,000 per year, and your supplies is equals to 10,000. So this brings us to a total of 37,360. So that would be your explicit cost. Now let us move on to the second question. Okay, now the second question wants us to determine the value of implicit cost. Now remember, implicit cost is the cost of using your own resources. So what you need to do is, from this case, you need to identify, okay, what would be the resources that are owned by Harry. Okay, so as you can see, the only own resources that Harry is going to use would be his own expertise. Okay, so if he's working for a foreign consultant, he will be earning about 78,000 per year. Okay, but when he wants to open up his own consultation firms, he would have to forego this earning. So this foregone salary is considered as implicit cost. Okay, so the implicit cost, okay, only comprise of the foregone salary, and that would be 78,000. Now that you have already calculated explicit cost and implicit cost, we would like to identify how much profit that Harry would earn. Okay, and remember, the most appropriate calculation of profit is going to be economic profit. Now, economic profit is the difference between total revenue and economic cost. Now, Harry has already identified that the total revenue per year is going to be 120,000. Okay. Now, economic cost here comprise of both explicit cost and implicit cost. Now, we have already calculated, okay, the two values being 37,360, and then you add it to the implicit cost, which is 78,000. Okay, so this brings us to a total of 4640 as the economic profit. All right. Okay, so now what would be Harry's best decision? Okay, so looking at the economic profit value, should Harry, proceed with his own consultation firm, or should he just work for somebody else? Okay, so we have already calculated, okay, that the economic profit should be 4640. So looking at the value of economic profit, you can see that Harry can continue opening up his own consulting firm. Now let's look at the second case. Okay, now the second case, okay, basically wants you to determine, okay, what would happen, okay, if total revenue decreases by 10,000. So the initial total revenue is 120,000. So now what happened is that total revenue decreases to 110,000. So given the later situation, should Harry continue to open up his own firm? Right? So let us look at the solution. Now, when total revenue decreased by 10,000, okay, you can see that Harry shouldn't start his own consulting firm. Okay, why is that the case? Because now he is making an economic loss. Okay, now because, okay, notice that, okay, when your economic profit is equals to 110,000, okay, you can see that, okay, your economic profit will eventually becomes negative. Okay, so can you identify that the economic profit, the new economic profit, is going to be negative value? Okay, so let us calculate it again. So your economic profit now, okay, so let us go back to the slide. Okay, so what happened is that, okay, your total revenue, okay, is now, okay, equals to 110,000. Your economic cost, okay, we have already calculated just now. So your economic cost, okay, should be equals to 37,360 just now. 37,360 plus 78,000. Okay, so this brings us to a total of, so we have 115,360. Okay, so we have 78,000, okay, plus 37,360. So that brings us to a total of 115,360. So because economic profit is equals to total revenue minus economic cost, okay, so what happened is that, okay, you're going to see that total revenue, the new value is 110,000, while your economic cost still maintained at 115,360. So you're going to get, okay, your economic value to be of negative value in the amount of 5,360. Now because you incur economic loss, therefore the firm, okay, shouldn't, or Harry shouldn't start his own consulting firm. Okay, so we have looked at two cases. Okay, the first cases whereby we have Amin, okay, inherited a construction company, so you need to decide whether Amin should pursue, okay, the construction company. In the second case, okay, we have Harry. Again, he wants to decide whether or not he should open up his own consultancy firm. And in the case of Harry, there is a reduction in total revenue. And so with the latest total revenue figure, you can see that it is not advisable for Harry to pursue his own consultancy firm. Okay, so now we have looked at the way economists define cost. So remember that when we talk about cost, in economics, we include both explicit and implicit cost, right? So explicit cost would be the cost of using the resources. It is an actual expenditure that you incur, but implicit cost is the cost of using your own resources in the production process, and it doesn't involve any cash payment. So to measure it, you usually measure in terms of the best alternative foregone. All right. Okay, so now that we have looked at the measurement of cost or the nature of cost, so the next topic would be looking at the short run cost function. Okay. Now, if you can recall from the previous lecture on production, we can see that our production process can be done in the short run and in the long run. Okay, so the same goes for our cost analysis. Our analysis, when it comes to cost of production, is divided into short run and long run. So what we're going to do is we're going to analyze what are the type of costs that firms needs to face in the short run. Okay, so that's our main aim in the second topic. Okay, now remember that in the short run, firm uses two types of input. Okay, so what are these input? So these are fixed input and also variable input. So when we talk about the cost that firms needs to incur, so the cost would comprise of fixed costs and also variable cost. Okay, so the total cost is actually the cost of all the productive resources that are used by the firm. Okay, so it can be divided into the two separate costs which I mentioned just now, fixed cost and also variable cost. So let us look at what actually are the two costs just now, fixed cost and variable cost. Okay, now when we talk about fixed costs, so these are the total obligations of the firm per time period for all the fixed inputs that the firm uses. In other words, fixed cost would be the cost of using the fixed input in the production process, and this would be include the costs that you pay for office rent, or the insurance, the fire insurance that you have to pay for the buildings, the machines that you have to pay in order to set up the company. So these can be considered as fixed costs. Now variable cost would be the total obligations of the firm per time period for all the variable inputs that the firm uses. So variable cost, in other words, comprise of the cost of using variable input. Now if we look at the definition of fixed cost and variable cost, they are consistent with the way we define fixed input and variable input. Now remember that in the short run, one of the input that we use is fixed input, and fixed input, as the name suggested, it is fixed in quantity. So when we talk about fixed cost, it is the cost of using fixed input, and therefore it is the same, it is constant with the level of production. So it doesn't matter how much you produce, but you're going to incur the same amount of fixed costs. But when we talk about variable costs, these are costs of using the variable inputs. Alright, so when you want to produce more, you buy more variable inputs, and therefore you incur more variable costs. But when you produce nothing, you basically purchase zero variable input, and therefore your variable cost is going to be zero. So variable cost, it varies with the level of production. So based on this explanation, we can conclude that in the short run, when we talk about total cost, it comprises of both total fixed cost and also total variable cost. So using so what we can do is we can represent it in the form of a mathematical formula. So because total cost usually is represented by TC, total fixed cost is represented by TFC, and total variable cost is usually represented by TVC. So when we talk about the total cost that firms gonna incur in the short run, it would be the sum of fixed cost plus variable cost. Okay. Now, apart from the total cost, firm is also interested to know about cost per unit. All right. Now, this brings us to the concept of average cost. Okay. So, average cost enable us to measure the cost per unit of output. Now, we can have or we can measure three types of average cost. We have average total cost, average fixed cost, and also average variable cost. Okay. Now, average total cost, okay, also sometimes known as average cost, equals to total cost per unit of output produced. Okay. In mathematical terms, you can represent average total cost in terms of TC divided by Q, where Q represents the number of output produced. Okay. Now, the second average cost concept would be average fixed cost, okay, which is actually equals to fixed cost divided by quantity produced. So in other words, average fixed cost enable us to identify the fixed cost per unit of output. So it can be measured by fixed cost, okay, FC divided by Q. And the last one, average variable cost, it is defined as the variable cost divided by quantity produced. Or in other words, it measures the variable cost per unit. So when you want to measure average variable cost, you simply take variable cost divided it by Q. Now, so when we talk about the average total cost in the short run, so average total cost would be the sum of average fixed cost and average variable cost, or in mathematical terms, it is ATC equals AFC plus average variable cost. Now, another important concept that you need to know would be the concept of marginal cost. Now, marginal cost is also known as incremental cost, okay? So it refers to the increase in total cost when you increase output by 1 unit. Okay, so marginal cost actually measures the additional amount of total cost as a result of increasing a unit of output. Okay, so marginal decisions are very important in determining the level of profit. So that's why it is very important for you to measure marginal cost. So how do you measure marginal cost? Well, marginal cost is the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. Okay, what we're going to do next is we're going to look at the shape, okay, of this cost curve. All right, but before we actually look at the graph, let me mention to you that when we talk about marginal cost curve, the average variable cost curve, and also the average total cost curve, they all have a U shape, okay, curve. Okay, so the curve for marginal cost, average variable cost, and also average total cost are generally U-shaped. Okay, so the U-shape, okay, in the short run is actually attributed to increasing and diminishing returns from a fixed size plant, okay, because the size of the plant in the short run is not variable. Okay, so why is that the case that the three curves just now are generally U-shaped? The fact that we have diminishing, okay, increasing and diminishing returns in the short run. Okay. Now, what would be the relationship between marginal cost and average cost curve? Now, the thing is, when marginal cost exceeds average cost, you're going to see that average cost curve must always rising. Okay, but when marginal cost is less than average cost, you're going to find out that the average cost must be falling. Okay, so this relationship explains, okay, why marginal cost curve should always intersect your average cost curve at the minimum of the average cost curve. All right, so let us look at how we actually sketch, okay, the three curves just now. Now, this is your marginal cost curve. As you can see, it is U-shaped. All right. Now, this The second diagram, the second curve that we draw here is the average variable cost curve. As you can see, the shape is also a U-shaped curve. Alright. Now notice that when we draw average variable cost and marginal cost curve together, you have to make sure that the marginal cost always intersect with the average variable cost at the minimum point of average variable cost. Okay. Now, so at the intersection point, okay, you'll be able to identify the amount of Q represented by Q star. So at Q star, what happened is that you'll be able to identify, okay, the value of output in which AVC is minimized. Okay, now bear in mind that, okay, this is also the same point whereby the average product of labor is maximized. Okay, remember that in the production function we have also looked at average product function in the short run. Okay, so this is actually the inverse function, okay, of average variable cost. Okay, now so this value on the vertical axis would give you the value of the minimum average variable cost. And when you multiply, okay, the average variable cost with quantity, you're going to get the total variable cost. Because remember, average variable cost is variable cost for 1 unit of output. So if you want to know how much is the total variable cost, you need to multiply AVC by the total output that you produce. Okay, so that's how you calculate total variable cost. Now, the third curve that we have here is the average total cost curve. Now notice that average total cost has a U-shape, okay, curve. Okay, so and also when you draw your average total cost, make sure that when it crosses, okay, the marginal cost curve, it should cut at the point whereby average total cost is minimized. Okay, so at this intersection point between marginal cost and average total cost, okay, you'll be able to identify the output level here, okay, and the value, okay, on the vertical axis would actually give the value for your average total cost, okay, at its minimum point. So as I said just now, okay, always make sure that when you draw marginal cost and average total cost together, marginal cost will intersect the average total cost at the minimum of the average total cost curve. Now, average total cost actually tells you the cost per unit of output. But if you want to know the total cost incurred, then you have to multiply by the total output produced. So here, total cost can be calculated by multiplying ATC with output level. Okay, now another rule that is very important is that when you draw your average total cost and average variable cost, you have to make sure that the distance between the two curves here gets smaller as output increases. Okay, now why is that the case? Because this vertical distance between average total cost and average variable cost represents average fixed cost. Okay, so for example, at Q double star, if you want to know what is the average total cost, you're going to move up until you reach your average total cost curve and you stop. So you're going to refer to the vertical axis to identify what's the value of the average total cost curve. So as you can see, the distance between point R to Q double star is the average total cost value. Now, at Q double star, if you want to know what's the value of average variable cost, so you're going to move up until you reach your average variable cost curve and you stop. Okay, so you're going to refer to the vertical axis to determine what's the value of the average variable cost curve. So you can see that it's AVC star, or basically the distance between J to Q double star. Okay, so that would be average variable cost. Now remember, just now I was pointing out to you that average total cost in the short run is the sum of average fixed cost and average variable cost. So if the distance between R to Q double star is your average total cost, while the distance between J to Q double star is your average variable cost, so this means that the distance between point R to point J is your average fixed cost. And average fixed cost, okay, what happens to it is that as output increases, the value should decreases, and this is represented by the distance between the two curves, which decreases or diminishes, okay, as output increase. Okay, so okay, when you draw, okay, your marginal cost and your average cost together, particularly the average total cost and average variable cost, there are certain rules that you have to follow. Okay, so make sure that when marginal cost is greater than average total cost must be rising. Okay, but when marginal cost equals to average total cost is at its minimum. Okay, and when marginal cost is less than average total cost, then average total cost should be falling. Okay, now when you draw marginal cost and average variable cost curve together, make sure that when marginal cost is greater than average variable cost should be rising. When marginal cost and average variable costs are equal, then average variable cost should be at its minimum point. And when marginal cost is less than average variable cost, then average variable cost is falling. Okay, so okay, after we have looked at the definition of the average cost, so these are the important average cost concept that you need to remember. Okay, bear in mind that average total cost, okay, is simply total cost divided by Q. Average fixed cost can be found by dividing total fixed cost with output level. Average variable cost is total variable cost divided by output. So the sum or the average total cost in the short run would be the sum of average fixed cost and average variable cost. Okay. Now another important cost concept that we need to know would be marginal cost, and marginal cost is the change in total cost divided by the change in output, or you can also calculate it by determining the change in total variable cost divided by the change in output. Now why is that the case? Because fixed cost, as the name suggested, is fixed. Okay, and because marginal cost measure the change in cost, and as you know, the only cost that can change is total variable cost. So to measure marginal cost, you can also calculate the change in total variable cost when you change your output level. Okay, so now that we have looked at the definition of cost in the short run, okay, and also the average cost concept, so let us look at a cost table, okay, which actually shows, okay, how we calculate, okay, the different value of cost. Okay, now if you look at this cost table, okay, you can see that when output is 0, total fixed cost is 60. Okay, but notice that there is no value for total variable cost. Because why? Because when you're not producing anything, you don't buy any variable inputs, and therefore your variable cost should be 0. So your total cost in this case should be equals to 60, which is the same as the value of fixed cost. Now, but once you start producing, okay, for example, when you produce 1 unit of output, you can see that you need to buy your variable input, and therefore you're going to incur your variable cost. Okay, so even though you are producing 1 output, but your fixed cost remains the same. It is still 60. Your variable cost is now 20. Okay, therefore your total cost is going to be 80. Now, if you want to calculate average fixed cost is total fixed cost divided by Q. That will give you 60. Average variable cost is variable cost divided by Q. That will be 20 divided by 1, which gives you 20. Average total cost is the sum of AFC and AVC. 60 plus 20, which give you 80. And marginal cost is the increase in total cost when you add in one output. So notice that when you produce 0 output, cost is 60. But when you start produce one output, cost becomes 80. So it must be the case that the increase in cost is equals to 20. So this is your marginal cost. And notice that this value of marginal cost is also equals to the change in your variable cost as you increase 1 unit of output. So when you increase your output by 1 unit, you can see that variable cost changes by $20. So that's why marginal cost is also 20. Okay, so this is a diagram which shows you all the costs involved in the short run. So here, if you look at the upper diagram here, we have the total variable cost curve. Okay, you can see that it increases with the level of production. As output increases, total variable cost increase. But when output is 0, total variable cost is 0. Now fixed cost is fixed, so it should be a straight horizontal line here, and as you can see, the shape of your total cost curve is the same as total variable cost. It's just that it is much higher than the position of total variable cost. Now why is that the case? Well, because the difference between total cost and total variable cost lies in the value of your fixed cost. Okay, now the bottom diagram actually show you the average cost and also marginal cost, which I have shown you much earlier. So notice that it still fulfill the identity that we have identified just now. So you can see that your average total cost is a U-shaped curve, and then we have your average variable cost. Now notice that when we draw these two curves together, the distance gets smaller as output increases. And then we have our marginal cost curve, which is also U-shaped, and you can see that marginal cost curve cuts the two average cost, average variable cost and average total cost at its minimum point. So for your information, so your average fixed cost curve, it should slopes down continuously. So the average total cost curve is the vertical summation of average fixed cost curve and also the average variable cost curve. The average total cost curve is always higher than the average fixed cost and average variable cost curve. And while output gets bigger, you can see that average fixed cost will decline up to 0. And your average variable cost curve approaches the average total cost curve. And one last thing before we look at some examples, for your information, when we talk about average variable cost, it is actually total variable cost divided by total output. You can also measure it by dividing wage rate with average product of labor, because remember that in the short run you are using combination of fixed input and variable input. Because variable input is usually comprised of labor, so the payment for labor is considered as wage rate, and if you divide by the value of average product, it will give you the value of average variable cost. Now when it comes to marginal cost, you can see that marginal cost is actually the change in total cost divided by the change in output, or simply change in total variable cost divided by change in output. Now your marginal cost is pretty much related to the marginal product curve, because your marginal cost is actually the wage rate divided by the marginal product function. So now that we have looked at the costs involved in the short run, so I hope that by now you are able to identify the different costs that a firm will incur in the short run production. So what we're going to do next is we're going to look at some examples, and we're going to try and understand the different component of cost. Okay, so let us try this example. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a total cost function. Okay, so we have Evergood, okay, a producer of toner for printers. Now, it has the following total cost function. Its TC equals to 1000 plus 50Q minus 10Q squared plus Q3. Okay, now this is a short run production function. Why is that the case? Because it has both the component of fixed cost and variable cost. Now, if you look at your total cost function, you can see that it has a fixed component or a constant value here. Now, this constant value, it is independent of the level of output. So it doesn't matter whether you produce 0 output, 100 output, or 1000 output. You can see that this value remains the same. Okay, so the constant value in your total cost function is what we call as the total fixed cost component. Okay, so if I were to ask you what is the total fixed cost value based on this cost function, then the value must be equals to 0, which is the constant value in the total cost function. Now, if we want to identify the variable cost function, what would that be? That would be, so because variable cost is the cost that depends on the level of output, so all the terms with Q, that would be your total variable cost component. So your total variable cost, in this case, would comprise of all the terms that have Q. Okay, so that's your total variable cost. So remember that total cost in the short run comprise of fixed cost and also variable cost. Total cost is the cost that doesn't depend on the output level. It is independent of the level of income, while variable cost is the cost that depends on the output level. If you produce 0, then variable cost will become 0. But when you start producing, variable cost will become positive. Okay. Now, you can also calculate total fixed cost. Okay. So, what we want to do next is we want to identify the average fixed cost function. Now, average fixed cost, have been identified to be total fixed cost divided by Q. So, if you were to find what is the average fixed cost function, then it is simply 1000 divided by Q. Alright. Now, what about average variable cost function? Now, average variable cost function, we have already defined it to be total variable cost divided by Q. Okay, so therefore, your average variable cost would require you to divide all the variable cost component with Q. So, what would be the average variable cost function? So, 50Q, we have to divide by Q. That will give us 50. Now, 10Q squared, you divide by Q, that will give you 10Q. And Q to the power of 3, if you divide it by Q, that will leave you with Q squared. Okay, so this is your average variable cost function. Okay, so if you were to derive to the average total cost function, what would that be? So it would be average fixed cost plus average variable cost. So it's going to be 1000 divided by Q plus your average variable cost, in this case 50 minus 10Q plus Q squared. Okay, now the last cost function that we want to derive here is marginal cost. Now remember that marginal cost is defined as the change in total cost when you change a unit of output, and this is consistent with the definition of differentiation. So when you want to derive to the marginal cost function, what you need to do is you need to differentiate the total cost function with respect to Q. So let me Okay, so what you are required to do is you need to differentiate all the component for your total cost. Now, if you differentiate a constant, remember you're going to get 0. If you differentiate 50Q, that will give you 50. Differentiating 10Q squared, okay, will give you 20Q. And differentiating Q to the power of 3 will give you 3Q squared. So your marginal cost function is going to be 50, okay, minus 20Q plus 3Q squared. Okay, so that's how you derive to the different cost function. Saya nak batuk sekejap. Okay. Let us try one last question. Okay. So this would be the last question for the day. Alright. So we have Syarikat Eco Maju. It is a company producing electrical appliances. Now, recently the company produces a new product, okay, power saving vacuum cleaner called Supermax. Okay. Now, this is a total cost function faced by the firm. It's 1000 plus 150Q minus 8Q squared plus 0.4Q to the power of 3. Okay. So Q here represent the quantity of Supermax produced. Now, what you need to do is you need to derive the following functions. Okay, so you have average fixed cost, average total cost, and also average variable cost, and also marginal cost function. Okay, so let us try and derive to this cost function. So let us okay. So let us try this. So it's your function just now was 1000. Okay, so you have 1000. Okay, so let me refer to the question again. So it should be 1000 plus 150Q minus 8Q squared plus 0.4Q to the power of 3. Okay, so this is the original total cost function. So let's look at the question again. What you need to do, you have to derive to 4 functions: AFC, AC or ATC, AVC, and also MC. Okay, now before we derive to the different function just now, so the first thing that you need to do is you need to identify what's your total fixed cost and your total variable cost. Now, can you identify what's your fixed cost? Okay, well, since fixed cost is the cost that doesn't depend on the output level, so your total fixed cost in this case is 1000. Okay, what about your total variable cost? So total variable cost would be all the costs that depends on the output level, and that would include 150Q minus 8Q squared plus 0.4Q to the power of 3. Okay, that's your total variable cost. Now, let's look at the question again. So first of all, you need to find average fixed cost. Okay, so how do you find average fixed cost? So it should be total fixed cost divided by Q, and that will be 1000 over Q. That's your average fixed cost. The second question wants you to derive to the average total cost function. Okay, because average cost or average total cost is the same thing. Okay, so average cost or average total cost, it's total cost divided by Q. So that means you have to divide each one of the component of the total cost by Q. So 1000 over Q plus 150 Q minus 8Q plus 0.4 Q squared. So that would be the average total cost function, and you also need to derive to the average variable cost function. And remember, average variable cost would require you to divide all this total variable cost component by Q. Okay, so 150Q divided by Q will give you 150. Okay, negative 8Q squared divided by Q will give you negative 8Q, and 0.4Q to the power of 3 divided by Q will give you 0.4Q squared. So basically these are your average variable cost function. So let me write the formula here. Okay, so that's your average variable cost. And the last function that you are requested to find would be marginal cost function. So can you still recall how do we find marginal cost? Yes, you need to differentiate the total cost function with respect to Q, and that would give you 150 minus 16Q plus 1.2 Q to the power of 2. Okay, so that's how you calculate or you derive to the marginal cost function. Okay, alright, so I hope that by now you already know how to derive to the different cost function. Now let's look at the next question. Now the question says, calculate the quantity at which marginal cost and average cost is minimum. Okay, so what do you understand from the question? The question wants you to find Q, okay, which is quantity, where marginal cost and average cost is minimized. Okay, so there are two things that you have to find here. One is Q, where marginal cost is minimized. The second one is Q, when average variable cost is minimized. So we're gonna do one by one, okay, at a time. So so let's start with finding, okay, the value of Q when marginal cost is minimized. Okay, so how do you find Q when marginal cost is minimized? Now, when we talk about minimization or maximization, you know that we are talking about optimization. And when we want to optimize something, what do we need to do? We need to differentiate the function and set it equals to 0. So the same thing applies here in the cost concept. So even though we are now in the cost chapter, but whenever we want to minimize or maximize something, it still requires you to differentiate the function and set it equals to 0. So here, okay, because you are required to find Q that minimize marginal cost, so if you want to minimize marginal cost, the rule says, or the optimization rule says, that you need to differentiate the marginal cost function and then set it equals to 0. Okay, now in the previous exercise we have already derived to our marginal cost function. Okay, so this is your marginal cost function which we have derived in the previous question. So I just put it here so that it's easy for us to refer to. Okay, so what do we need to do with the marginal cost function? We want to minimize it. If we want to minimize it, we want to differentiate it. So now let's differentiate, okay, this marginal cost function. So if you differentiate 150, you're going to get 0. Differentiating negative 16Q will give you negative 16. Okay, if you differentiate 1.2Q squared, that will give you 2.4Q. Okay, and you have to set it equals to 0. Okay, so what do we need to do next? You simply solve for Q. So 2.4Q, okay, equals to 16. Okay, so if you want to find Q, okay, so Q will be equals to 16 divided by 2.4. Okay, so what is 16 divided by 2.4? Alright, so this would give us 6.67 units. Okay, so that's how you find the value of Q, which minimize marginal cost. Alright, now remember that the question also wants you to find Q that minimize average variable cost. So how do you find the value of Q which minimize AVC? Okay, so let's try to solve this. So now what we want to do is we want to find Q, okay, but the one that can minimize average variable cost. Okay, so that's what the question wants. You want to find quantity at which AVC is minimized. Now, so whenever we want to minimize or maximize something, again, it is optimization. And optimization would require you to differentiate the function and then set it equals to 0. So it doesn't matter whether you want to minimize AVC or minimize marginal cost or minimize average total cost. But the thing is, whenever you want to minimize something, that's optimization. And you have to differentiate the function that you want to minimize. Okay, so let me copy the average variable cost function which we have derived just now. Okay, so that would be much easier for you to refer to. So this is your average variable cost function, which is 150Q minus 8Q plus 0.4Q squared. So you are asked to minimize it, which requires you to differentiate it. Okay, so let's differentiate the average variable cost function. Okay, so when you differentiate your average variable cost function, so what do we get? So differentiating 150Q will give you 150. Differentiating 8Q will give you 8. And when you differentiate 0.4Q squared, you will get 0.8Q. Ini tak keluar? Alamak. So maksudnya banyak tadi lah. Ada few things yang I type kat sini. Tapi dia tak keluar kat situ
Ini soalan yang pilih.
Tak pun. Dia kan example 3 dengan 4 ni kan, I buat dekat kat sini. So
dah masuk 4 lah.
Dah masuk 4 dah. Ataupun sekejap.
Ya, dah tutup slide dulu.
Ke you nak kena saya explain balik yang example 3 and 4 ni balik?
Doktor dah explain yang example 3 kan?
Example 3 dah.
Cuma doktor just start yang apa? Calculation untuk example 3 lah.
Example 4 pun tak nampak juga.
Itulah.
Kan? So saya kena explain dua-dua sekali kan? Example 3 and 4 lah kan? Tak apalah sebab tadi saya explain sambil saya type. So tak apalah, saya just baca je lah kalau macam tu. Kan? Okay, kejap Then better saya habiskan type ni lah. Sikit lagi. So yang ni 3.8Q.
So nanti doktor start dengan
Example 3 dulu. 10. Okay, maksudnya kalau macam ni baru nampak. Sini keluar tak?
Example slide je lah.
Ada keluar
Yang slide keluar.
Okay, so maksudnya masa saya explain example 3 ni,
Kita tutup slide dulu.
tutup slide dulu.
Kita memang tulis je dulu. Memang dekat slide.
Saya ingatkan bila saya type tadi macam diorang nampak lah kat situ. Okay. Okay, kalau macam tu saya explain baiklah example 3 ni, tapi tak ada jalan macam maksudnya saya just baca je lah, saya tak tunjukkan satu persatu lah, sebab saya ingatkan saya tunjuk satu persatu bila saya type kat situ. Okay, tak apalah, so saya baca je lah. Okay, so okay, start Okay, let's try an example where we can apply the concept of short run cost of production. Okay, so in this example 3, we have a company by the name of Evergood, a producer of toner for printers. Okay, and it faces with the following total cost function. So we have 1000 plus 50q minus 10q squared plus q to the power of 3. Now, from this total cost function, what we would like to do is we would like to derive to the different cost concept which I have explained to you just now. So we're going to start by deriving the total fixed cost. Okay, now if you are given a short run production function, now the constant value, okay, is your fixed cost value. Okay, why is that the case? Because by definition, fixed cost is the cost that doesn't depend on the level of output. Okay, so it is fixed. Okay, the value should be the same. So it doesn't matter whether you produce 0 output, 100 output or 1000 output, but your fixed cost component should remain the same. Okay, so in this case, you can see that the constant value of 1000 is the fixed cost. So looking at this cost function, if 1000 is fixed cost, it means the other component, that is 50q minus 10q squared plus q to the power of 3, is your variable cost function. So if you were asked to derive to the total variable cost function, then it would be the one that depends on the level of q. So in other words, it would be the terms with q. Okay. Now the next one is we want to derive to the average cost function. Okay. Now we have 3 types of average cost: average fixed cost, average variable cost, and also average total cost. Now remember, average fixed cost is total fixed cost divided by Q. Now because we have already identified 1000 to be the value of fixed cost, therefore your average fixed cost function is 1000 over Q. That is how you derive to the average fixed cost function. Okay, it's as simple as that. Now, let's proceed with average variable cost function. Now, if you can still recall, to calculate average variable cost, you need to divide total variable cost by Q. So, because total variable cost is this function, so what you need to do is you have to divide each of the component of variable cost by Q. So 50Q here, you divide it by Q, that will give you 50. 10Q squared, you divide it by Q, that will give you negative 10Q. And Q to the power of 3 divided by Q will give you Q squared. So your average variable cost is 50 minus 10Q plus Q squared. Okay. Okay, the last average cost concept that we want to derive is your average total cost. Now, remember, average total cost is average fixed cost plus average variable cost. So, if you want to derive to the average total cost function, what you need to do is simply add the average fixed cost function to the average variable cost function, and that will give you 1000 over Q plus 50 minus 10Q plus Q squared. Okay, so that's how you derive to the average total cost function. Now, the last cost concept that we want to derive here is marginal cost. Now remember, marginal cost measures the change in total cost when you change a unit of output. Now, when you want to derive to the marginal cost function, then you need to use the concept of differentiation, because differentiation also measures the change, okay, in your independent variable. So here, when you want to derive to the marginal cost function, all you need to do is you need to differentiate the total cost function with respect to Q. So this is your total cost function. So let's differentiate it. So when you differentiate 1000, you should get 0. Okay. When you differentiate 50Q, that will leave you with 50. Differentiating 10Q squared will give you 20Q. And when you differentiate Q to the power of 3, you will get 3Q squared. Okay, so if you simplify this, you will end up getting marginal cost equals to 50 minus 20Q plus 3Q squared. Okay, so I have shown you how we derive, okay, the different type of cost function. Now, why is it important for us to derive to the cost function? Well, the next example, which I'm going to show you, will basically illustrate, okay, how we use, okay, the equations for cost. Okay, now let's look at, okay, this example. Okay, so you have another case, Syarikat Eco Maju. Okay, it is a company producing electrical appliances. Now, recently what happened, the company produces a new product. Okay, it is a power saving vacuum cleaner called Supermax. Now, this company's total cost is now 1000 plus 150Q minus 8Q squared plus 0.4Q to the power of 3. Okay. Now, Q here represent the quantity of Supermax produced. Okay. So let's look at the question. Now, you are required to derive the following functions: average fixed cost, average total cost, average variable cost, and also marginal cost. So notice that this question is very much similar to the example 3 that we did just now. Okay, so let us look at how we derive to the different functions. Okay, so remember that your total cost function is 1000 plus 150Q minus 8Q squared plus 0.4Q to the power of 3. Now, before we derive to the required function, what you need to do first of all is you need to decide what is your fixed cost and also variable cost. Now, remember, fixed cost is the constant value in your cost function. Okay, so since 1000 is the constant value, then 1000 is the fixed cost. Okay, so the remaining component is your variable cost. So in this case, 150Q minus 8Q squared plus 0.4Q to the power of 3 is your variable cost. Okay, now let us start answering the question. And the first question wants you to derive to the average fixed cost function. And we know that average fixed cost is total fixed cost divided by Q. Okay, you have already identified fixed cost to be 1000. Okay, so you divide by Q, so that is your average fixed cost function. Okay, now the next question wants you to derive to the average total cost function. Now, if you look at the formula which I gave you earlier, average total cost is total cost divided by Q. So this is your total cost function. So to find average total cost, you have to divide each of these terms by Q. So 1000 divided by Q leave you with 1000 over Q. 150Q, okay, you divide by Q, that will give you 150. Okay, and then 8Q squared divided by Q will give you 8Q. And 0.4Q to the power of 3, if you divide it by Q squared, if you divide it by Q, it will leave you with 0.4Q squared. Okay. Now, next one is average variable cost. Now, average variable cost is variable cost divided by Q. Okay. So, if you divide the total variable cost component by Q, that will leave you with 150 minus 8Q plus 0.4Q squared. Okay, and the last question wants you to derive the marginal cost. Now remember, marginal cost requires you to differentiate the total cost function with respect to Q. So if this were your total cost function, to find marginal cost, we need to differentiate it. Okay, so if you differentiate 1000, you'll get 0. Differentiate 150Q will give you 150. Differentiate 8Q squared will give you 16Q. And differentiating 0.4Q to the power of 3 will give you 1.2Q squared. Okay, so now we have answered the first question, which wants us to derive to the 4 different types of function, namely AFC, AC, AVC, and marginal cost. Now, let us proceed with the last question. Now, the last question wants you to calculate quantity at which marginal cost and average variable cost is minimum. So meaning that this question requires you to calculate 2 things. One, quantity where marginal cost is minimized. Another one is quantity when average variable cost is minimized. Okay, so let us look at how we answer this question. Okay, now let's start with the first one. Okay, so the first question wants you to find Q where marginal cost is minimized. Okay, now when you see the term minimizing, okay, or minimize, you know that this is optimization. Okay, because optimization involves minimizing or maximizing. Okay, so when you want to find, okay, a minimum or a maximum value, you have to differentiate the function and set equals to 0. So in other words, when you want to minimize marginal cost, you have to differentiate the marginal cost function and set equals to 0. Okay, now before you can minimize or differentiate the marginal cost function, you need to have the marginal cost function first, and this is your marginal cost function. So if you differentiate it because you want to minimize it, that will leave you with negative 16 plus 2.4Q, and you have to set it equals to 0. Okay, so you bring Q to one side, numbers to the other side, and solve for Q. Alright, and you will get Q equals to 6.67 units. So meaning that if marginal cost is minimized, the value of output must be 6.67 units. Okay, now the second half of the question wants you to find Q where average cost is minimized. So again, minimizing or maximizing, that's optimization. It requires you to differentiate the function and set equals to 0. So because you want to minimize average variable cost, you have to differentiate average variable cost and set equals to 0. Okay, so this is the average variable cost which you have derived just now. So when you differentiate it, okay, you will end up getting negative 8, okay, plus 0.8Q, and you set it equals to 0. So if you want to solve for Q, so you have to bring Q on one side, figures on the other side, so you will end up getting Q equals to 10. Okay, so in this case, when you want to minimize average variable cost, the value of output must be equals to 10. Alright, so in these 2 exercises, what we have done is we have looked at how we derive to the different cost function in the short run. Okay, and we have also looked at how we use the different cost function to achieve certain objective of the firm. So in this example, what we did was we were trying to identify the value of output required if you want to achieve minimum average variable cost, where in the previous examples, what we did was we were trying to identify the value of output if the firm wants to minimize marginal cost. Okay, so you can find different levels of output to achieve the different types of objective that the firms wants to achieve. Okay, so what we have done so far for today is we have looked at the nature of cost, or the way economists calculate costs. Okay, so bear in mind that we only consider 2 types of costs, namely explicit and implicit cost. Alright, so explicit cost would be the cost that involve actual cash payment. Implicit cost is the cost of using your own resources in the production process, and it doesn't involve any cash payment. Okay, and the second half of the lecture actually looks at the short run cost. Okay, or in other words, the cost that you experience in the short run. Okay, so we have looked at different concept of cost, namely fixed cost and variable cost, okay, which comprise of the total cost in the short run. We have also looked at the average cost concept, because that enables you to identify the cost per unit. So we have looked at average variable cost, average fixed cost, average total cost. And we have also looked at marginal cost, which allow us to identify the increase in cost when you add in more output. Alright, so I hope that when you go back, you can try more questions just to see that you get a whole of the concept that we have just discussed. So for the next lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the long run cost. Okay, so we're going to see what are the type of costs that firms going to incur when they produce in the long run. Okay, so that's it for today. So we'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you.